So our talk for today will take us to Dunya, to Cairo, and to the Roaring 20s. At the same time, before we start, we would also like to offer our solidarity to what is happening in Palestine and in Gaza right now. So I was just reading the news so far. The last number from Gaza are 30 kids killed today and over 100 people killed. So it's heartbreaking to follow this news, and it's heartbreaking also, and it's enraging also to see how actually the media are also portraying what's happening currently in Gaza and Palestine. I will introduce first our speaker for today. And Raphael Cormack, welcome, Raphael, and thanks for accepting our invitation. So Raphael Cormack has a PhD in Egyptian theater from the University of Edinburgh. His thesis was on Arabic translations and adaptations of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. He is currently a visiting researcher at Columbia University and works as an editor, writer, and translator from Arabic. And he has edited 2 collections of short stories from Arabic, the Book of Cairo and the Book of Khartoum. And Midnight in Cairo is his first book, and he will tell us a little bit about it today in his talk. So as I was saying, our talk for today will be focused on Dunya, on Cairo, and will take us to the Roaring 20s, to the nightlife and entertainment scene of Egypt at that time, and it will also show us actually the lives of the women who were behind this entertainment scene. So welcome, Raphael, and thanks for accepting our invitation. And we will follow the usual format, that is the lecture will last roughly 45 minutes, and we will leave circa 30 minutes for questions and answer after that.
I also just wanted to echo, Teresa, your words of solidarity with what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza, just across the border from Egypt, where we're going to be talking about. I mean, I often feel very kind of powerless in moments like this, and seeing what people are going through, they went through last night, and what will probably happen again tonight. So I think we would invite people, if anyone has any resources that they can share that they would suggest, we invite them to put it in the chat. I donate to medical aid for Palestinians. But if anyone has any better ideas, we invite you to put anything in the chat. But now we will, in these tough times, get to the talk. Hope everyone can see that.
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that little gap. Wouldn't happen again. And you have my email down there at the bottom in case anyone would like to be in contact with me about this later. I mean, basically, what I want to talk about today all comes in within the context of a book I've just released called Midnight in Cairo, which essentially tries to weave the stories of 7 of the most sort of prominent and interesting and powerful of the women of Cairo's nightlife of the 1920s predominantly, but also of the period a little bit before and a little bit after. And what I want to talk about today is some of the opportunities that looking at nightlife, popular culture, and that kind of thing can give you when you want to talk about women's lives, but also some of the problems with the sources that we have, looking at where we get the information from a lot of the time, memoirs, journals, this kind of thing. So yeah, both at what opportunities this can offer you and also what difficulties we have to negotiate when telling this, what is a sort of really fascinating history of popular culture in 1920s Egypt. And my starting point for this is going to be, the 1920s, the age of the mantle. And I don't know if anyone else has this experience. I certainly do, looking through a lot of the journals and the kind of literary magazines of the 1920s, and you see often a sea of men's faces. I mean, these are sort of examples here that I've picked out almost completely at random, just the first ones that came to me. So the top right is actually the Apollo group, a sort of avant-garde literary group of the 1920s. The top left is a meeting of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the bottom left is some Egyptian students touring the sites of the pharaonic sites of Upper Egypt. And the thing you will notice about these pictures, of course, is that there are no women in any of them. And that's often kind of for people who write about the literature, at least the sort of the high literary scene of the 1920s and 30s. That's often something you come up against. I mean, to say nothing of the political scene, in which there are really very few women at all. One response to this, of course, has been to look at the feminist movements that were sort of beginning to flourish in 1920s Egypt, and a lot of people have done that. So on the left here, you see not a sea of men's faces, but a sea of women's faces, all attending a lecture given by, pictured on the left, Hoda Sha'rawi, of course, the most famous Egyptian feminist of the 1920s and probably ever. But there are, many others. So Marilyn Booth has worked a lot on women's biography, particularly Zainab Fawaz. There's a cover of her book there. Female writers, and May Ziada, who is pictured, is another woman who people go to really kind of get a women's perspective on this period. But where people don't often go, and where I've tried to go with my book, is to the nightlife of Cairo. And I mean, just for instance, there we have a picture of Ramses' troupe, which is a troupe run by Yusuf Wahbi, and you see a sort of mixed group of people, men and women together. And really, what made me come to this book was partly my research on Egyptian theatre more generally. As Teresa mentioned, I did my PhD on adaptations of Oedipus in Egypt. And while going through that, I came across just all these incredible women's stories, which were sort of often not put to the forefront. And I mean, just to give a couple of examples that I talk about a little in the book, there is the story of Badia Masabni, who was born in Damascus to a sort of middle-class family. Although her father then died, she ended up in great poverty and sort of traveled around a lot as a child, went to Buenos Aires for a bit, but eventually sort of winds up first on Cairo stages, then on the nightclub stages of Beirut, and then finally back in Cairo, where she buys her own cabaret, which becomes the most successful cabaret in Egypt in the 1920s and 30s. She runs it independently. She makes a large fortune out of it, and sort of for our purposes, for today's talk, she turns herself into a massive public celebrity, and so we can sort of follow the ups and downs of her life. We know her life story, which is in a lot of detail, more detail than we might know the life story of other women born into sort of what became poverty in the late 19th century in Egypt. And then, of course, as she becomes a celebrity, we know more and more, and we can really sort of get her story. And she is just one of the many of these women. As we'll say, as we'll sort of see later on, what I'm not trying to say is that all these women's stories are sort of a great success. I mean, I think for people performing in the nightlife in Cairo in the 1920s, there was opportunity in the way that, say, Badia Masabni seized, but there was also a lot of danger, a lot of, sexualization by audience members, and maybe this is something we can talk about a little bit more in the Q&A. And nightclub stars were, in one famous example, were killed on stage. So I'm not trying to say this was a rosy period, but what I am trying to say is that it is a period where we see some of these sort of incredible women's stories that we don't often get access to. So the question then becomes, and what I'm going to look at in most detail is, okay, how do we have these stories? How do they really come down to us? what sources are we using to get at them, what is missing from those sources, and what these sources can give us. So the first question is, often that historians get asked is, okay, what archives did you use? And here I have a quote from Edward Said, who actually met and was sort of friends with Tahir Carioca, one of the women featured in the book. And he says that Tahir's life, despite the proliferating videos and retrospectives of her films, etc., symbolize the enormous amount of life in the Arab world, which goes unrecorded and unpreserved. I mean, his view is that none of the Arab countries I know have proper state archives, public record offices, or official libraries, any more than any of them has decent control over their monuments or antiquities. What I have is a sense of a sprawling, teeming history off the page, out of sight and hearing, beyond reach, largely unrecoverable. And what he's talking about here is a problem that a lot of people complain about, which is that the archival sources just simply aren't there in a lot of cases, partly because archives, say in Egypt, are so difficult to access, but also because nightlife like this is the kind of thing that's not preserved in archives, generally speaking. I have to say, I did use a couple of archives. So we have the Mohammed Yusuf Nejm collection in AUB is recently acquired. It mostly includes scripts, but some letters. So there's perhaps some good things in there. I used for some, random assortments from the King's College Cambridge archives. But I mean, I think I agree with Said. They are few and far between, which is not to say that they could not exist, that such things could not be found. So I have a picture here from the 60s of Naimael Masreya, one of the great theatre stars and singers of the 1920s. And you can see her here with the music and the scripts of the plays that she performed in the 1920s. Now, I don't know what happened to these, but presumably there exist family archives. And so I've got this second half of that quote from Edward Said, not wanting to leave out that our history is mostly written by foreigners, visiting scholars and intelligence agents. I am not an intelligence agent, but I am a visiting scholar. Whereas a lot of history is sort of relies on family knowledge. And I could not use any of this, but there are people like Hussein Omar, Shireen Saikali, who are starting to work on using family history, which I think could be in the future a very kind of fruitful avenue of research for this kind of period, because it seems like stuff does exist. But I myself did not use any. Where I really found the most information is on the one hand, and that's what we'll talk about first, these celebrity magazines of the 1920s. So in the 1920s in Egypt, there is this new cabaret culture, theater culture building up. It's existed for a little while, but it's really sort of reaching a peak in the 1920s, which also corresponds to a real peak of production of magazines like the ones pictured here. So magazines about entertainment, sort of more gossipy magazines in general. So I mean, you have Rose Al Yusuf magazine there, incidentally set up by an actress who had first been a vaudeville actress and then went into the press. You also have things like Image, or the Arabic version of which is Musawwar, and you have El Mumassil. There's a ton. I mean, in the mid-1920s, anyone who was interested in nightlife, theater, and entertainment, it seemed, was setting up their own magazine. And they are thick with stories of nightlife, and particularly in stories of women of Cairo's nightlife and entertainment scene. I mean, as you might expect from celebrity magazines, women are a particular focus. And the sort of level of fascination that these magazines have with women sometimes borders on the slightly obsessive, but includes things like, so we have an article here on the right, which was a very common kind of article in the houses of actresses, in which they would visit an actress's house, take photos of her, and have a brief interview. So I mean, there's a lot of material there, for instance, on exactly how actresses were living at the time, sometimes quite lavishly, as well as these slightly more esoteric articles, such as our singers and actresses, what they do in the first hour after they wake up, what's on their table, what they eat, what their views are on love and marriage. There's a constant sort of rotation of articles like this, interviewing people, asking for their opinions on slightly bizarre things. And of course, again, as we might expect, the appearance of these actresses is often put into strong focus. So we have on the left here a survey which ran in Naimael Masreya magazine for quite a long time, asking who the most beautiful actress in Egypt was, as well as sort of in smaller writing and sort of who the best one was, as well as this slightly more distasteful one, which is who the ugliest actress in Egypt was. And sometimes the sort of the level of information that they go into is somewhat striking. So here we have an article on, actually an extremely interesting article, part of on the left, on how much actresses are getting paid, which for a historian is kind of a great tidbit of information. So Fatima Rushdie, who was, when this article was written, I think it's 1926, probably one of the biggest actresses in Egypt. She's getting 20 Egyptian pounds a month, and has this sort of her fortune, her money that she's saved up is 80 Egyptian pounds. So not that much. And actually it turns out from this article that actresses don't get paid that much money. But then the next article they have, which is from Rosa Youssef, lists the weights of various different actresses. So the level of kind of intrusiveness is striking. But if we're thinking 100 years in the time, also some of the information, I think the information about actresses' weights, if we believe it even, is probably not that interesting. But the information about how much they're getting paid is very, a good way to build up a much better picture of what's going on at the time. But there are, of course, problems with using celebrity magazines like this as a historical source, if we want to. And one big one is they're stuffed full of gossip, and how true any of it is really sort of is up to you whether or not you believe it. A lot of the gossip about women is, of course, about their love affairs, who they're maybe getting married to, and we can sort of choose to believe that or not. This case I have here is about this actor on the left called Ahmed Bey, who made a bit of a name for himself in Germany in the 1920s, working in the cinema. He worked, he said, with Fritz Lang. He also starred in, or not starred in, but he had parts, reasonable parts, in a number of German movies in the 1920s. And here, Rosa Youssef magazine prints this little article saying that German police have discovered him in his house a small quantity of hashish, as well as a false passport. And then a few issues later, they're forced to issue a retraction because his brother has come to their office and told them that it's not true. Now, I don't know how you sort of come down either side on this, except by being extremely lucky in finding the German police records. But there's all these kinds of stories build up in which, are they gossip? Is there really anything to them? Is a question that's pretty hard to answer. One of my kind of approaches to these magazines is to really see these women's lives. So we have on the left there is Badi'a Masabni, who we also mentioned, and in the middle is Naimael Masreya, who we mentioned very briefly, an Egyptian actress who was said to be the first Muslim Egyptian actress. Whether or not that's true, she certainly was the first Egyptian woman to lead a successful theatrical troupe in the 1910s, and did a very successful Arabic adaptation of the opera Carmen. But what these pictures sort of represent is that there was a sense, certainly amongst the actresses, that their appearance in the press was a kind of performance. So here Naimael Masreya sends in pictures in which she's dressed up as a man, and the newspaper asks you to guess who this actress is. Badia Masabni also obviously they're done up in big style. So what I would like to do is sort of get away from this question of whether or not it's gossip or fact, is say that these women's appearances in these magazines are as much a performance as their appearances on stage or in the cabarets are, and really look at it from that perspective. So these magazines are just an extension of their public lives, of their performance. And the question often of not, or whether a particular piece of gossip is true, is not as important as whether people are actually talking about it. So we have in these, and this is what's going to bring me on to the next topic, as well as these kind of articles, these interviews about what people are eating, where they live, who's most beautiful, all of this kind of stuff. What we do have in these magazines is places where women can tell their own stories in a partially, of course, mediated way, but in their own words, it appears. And so on the right here, I have from Rosa Youssef magazine, this is a small section of the memoirs of Aziza Amir, who was, I mean, a really fascinating woman, the first, really, the woman who made the first Egyptian film, quote unquote. I mean, exactly what that means again is problematic, but she, in the 1926, 1927, she got together and with a Turkish director and produced, starred in, and really kind of directed the path of, even if she was not formally the director of, this movie called Layla, which was the first Egyptian movie ever, and sort of really got the Egyptian film business going in the 1920s. And in Rosa Youssef, a series of her memoirs are serialized over a number of issues. So as well as having these more gossipy articles, what we do get in these magazines is the life writing of women who otherwise, we would not really hear from. And this, as decades move on in the 20th century, this sort of genre of celebrity memoir becomes massive, and almost all of the female stars of the period in some way produce a memoir. So this is really the other main source of information that we have for what life was like for women of the nightclub stages of the 1920s and 1930s. They often differ quite a lot in ways that I will get into in how they're produced. And it's worth noting that unlike that article by Tahir Carioca, these are largely done towards the end of a successful career. A lot of them are produced in the 50s and 60s, but stars of the 20s and 30s. So obviously they carry with them a kind of sense that maybe they're settling old scores, they're looking back at a career, they're not told contemporaneously. And so the one that I have on the bottom right, which is actually Yusuf Wakbi's memoirs, who was a big actor at the time, is a kind of great example of the score settling, slightly catty actor's memoir. He's, every anecdote is sort of designed to make him the victor. And he often mentions that even though some person has been credited with, doing this amazing thing, it was actually him that did it. And there's a lot of that kind of thing in theatrical memoirs, of course. And then, so we have Rosa Youssef memoirs, of course, on the bottom left there, which are also done in the 50s, looking back at a career and looking. So, I mean, we have to take them through that lens and see that that's what they're doing. There's also a question in a lot of them of who they're filtered through. I mean, this has been a question in the press as well. I mean, when we see an article written by Aziza Amir in the 1920s of her memoirs, how much has that been edited? How much is there control over it? But in the case of some of these, so this is Badia Masabni's memoirs here, which were published in, they don't have a date, but around 1960 in Beirut. They are explicitly written by someone else, this woman, Nezik Basila. And it seems that they were done via a series of interviews, probably with Badi'a Masabni, and then written by her. So exactly how much of Badi'a Masabni's words you're getting is hard to know. And the most obvious case of this problem comes with Fatima Rushdie's memoirs. I apologize for sort of going through so many names, and if you want to know more about them, I do talk about them in some length in the book. But just basically to say, Fatima Rushdie was of the 1920s and 30s, very much of the theatre scene. She ran, competing with Yusuf Wahbi, whose memoirs we already saw, the great Egyptian sort of slightly higher end theatre troupe, and ran it very successfully through the late 1920s and 30s, and went on a series of tours across the Arab world and Europe too, and was really sort of one of the top dogs in the area. But she left behind a sort of a very confusing set of different memoirs. So in 1971, she published 2 different memoirs, Kafahi fil Masra Cinema, so my struggle in the theatre and the cinema, and also Between Love and Art. And they are, I mean, they go over a lot of the same ground, but they are different in significant ways. They tell slightly different stories. They don't really contradict each other, but they don't tell the same story. And then equally in 1964, she left another serialized set of memoirs in an Egyptian theatre magazine, which goes over similar ground again, but is not exactly the same. And in a book she wrote about her former husband, Aziz Aid, she tells again a lot of the stories of her life. So there's those 4 memoirs in which she tells different stories. And then there's also the earliest one, which was one of these memoirs filtered through a journalist, Mohammed Rifat, published in Beirut. That one is a lot more, has a lot more saucy stories, is a lot more gossipy, talks a lot more about kind of sexual relationships and that kind of thing. And what we're to make of that is unclear. Is that just because it was published in Beirut, where it's easier to publish that kind of thing? Is that because the editor, so-called, added a lot of these stories? Is it because he just happened to manage to get Fatima Rushdie to tell these stories? What's going on there? Why did she write, in the space of a sort of a decade, 3 different memoirs which go over the same kind of ground? Are we looking at competing? I mean, published in the same year. It's very. Since I don't know that much about the circumstances of their publication, I don't really have an answer to this, but it strikes me as very strange. And it's not an unusual case. There are often competing memoirs of the same person. So recently, the Egyptian academic Shaban Youssef published what he calls the unknown memoirs of Naguib el-Rayhani, in which he'd found, Naguib el-Rayhani being the great sort of vaudeville star of the period, in which he'd found a new set of sort of serialized memoirs. And in the introduction to that, he speculates that the memoirs which we'd already had before, as written by Naguib el-Rayhani, had actually been faked by someone or were not reliable. How much of this is going on exactly, I don't know. I haven't delved into the specifics of the Naguib el-Rayhani case, so I can't really comment. But when we're looking at these memoirs, there's a lot of great information in there, and it's in the memoirs that we get the stories of the early lives of so many of these actresses, and these are the kind of stories which you don't see very often in the theatrical press, but they really tell you kind of a lot about the people who grew up in a different social class from the feminists like Hoda Sharawi and Zainab Fawaz, even, who are the normal subjects for feminist biography. So good stories, of course, but questionable in some cases. And also, as we were saying before, written with a particular purpose in mind. I mean, all of these things are not obviously exclusive to these memoirs. These are the kind of questions obviously we ask about sources in general, but in the cases, for instance, of these theatrical memoirs, they often stick to a recognizable pattern. And I'm not only talking about, there is a recognizable pattern partly in the lives of a lot of these exceptional women, the ones who appeared on stage in cabarets as singers. For instance, almost all of them, their fathers died when they were very young, which is a striking pattern, which may be, I mean, just, you know, of course, is probably true, but it's amazing how it fits into this pattern. But there's also, you know, another kind of way of telling the stories, which sometimes seems to occlude some of the complexities of how women were living in the 1920s. So often, or actually almost exclusively, these women's biographies, the women, they like to portray themselves as exceptional, kind of groundbreaking, one of a kind women who really fought against you know, a lot of pressure and succeeded kind of on their own, which I think again is true in a lot of cases, but it makes you ask some questions. So Fatima Rushdie, who is pictured there on the left, who wrote all those biographies, all those autobiographies. Her sisters, who are pictured here on the right, Ratiba and Saraf, were also pretty big stars in the 1920s and 30s. Not as big as her, but they were actresses in the 20s. And then by the late 20s, beginning of the 1930s, they teamed up together as the sisters and opened their own cabaret, which was pretty successful. I mean, not as successful as Badiya Musavni's, but they did well and were constantly in the limelight. But basically nowhere in any of Fatima Rushdie's memoirs does she really mention them. She mentions them all growing up together as children, but anything about their careers in the 20s and 30s is really glossed over, which strikes me as, you know, on the one hand, quite annoying, because one of the stories you would want to tell about women of this period is perhaps, you know, how they supported each other, and how they build a community and this kind of stuff, but it just doesn't seem to be there, which is not to say that it's not there. Perhaps it's just the sort of the way that these memoirs are written has to be one exceptional woman, and therefore stories like the stories of Fatima Rushdie's two sisters just get missed out. So there are in looking at that. So yeah, in these different sources, I mean, and as I say, archives are an issue still to be sort of confronted, but I think there is definitely some possibility in there. I mean, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Edward Said, but for now, it's a very difficult place to look. But as going through all of this, kind of all of this period, as I was going through my research, I mean, these really two kinds of sources stick out, which are to say, I'm going to just take this off screen so you don't get bogged down in reading it, which is to say the entertainment press of the 1920s and 30s, which was filled with stories of actresses, women, and all of that. I mean, and really in a rather too much detail sometimes, but interestingly so. And then memoirs. So in both of these, we have a lot of material, but there are definitely pitfalls to avoid. One of these is later levels of exaggeration, which have been built on top of stories. So as I said before, I see stories about women in the press in some way as being part of their performance on stage. So I'm not as dismissive or skeptical, should we say, as some people are about contemporary gossip about women. Even if we think, you know, maybe it didn't happen, I still think it's an important part of their whole public performance, and as such, important part of the whole story. If you were someone who was going to a cabaret or a theater in 1920s Cairo, you would know these kind of stories. And so for that reason, I mean, I think they're important. But one thing which I think is sort of not so important, from my perspective at least, is what then gets added to these stories later on. And there's, as happens with all kind of slightly mythologies of golden ages of performance, lots of later accretions grow onto stories. I mean, the first one kind of thing that happens is that certain people and events get very, or what I would call, sticky. So, for instance, everyone wants to tell the story of what blank star did in the 1919 revolution because it's such an important part of Egyptian history. And some of these stories are, to me, a little, I mean, they sort of they don't add up. So, for instance, Naimael Masreya, there's a book about her published in which there's a very good story in which she's participating in the 1919 revolution, and one of her fans gets arrested by the British, and she goes to try and bail out the fan from prison, and the British say you can only visit him and bail him out if you're married to him. So on the spot, she marries him and then gets him out of prison, and everyone kind of lives happily ever after. But she is married in 1919 already, and has been for about 10 years. So I mean, the story just time-wise doesn't really check out. And it's just an example of how events like the 1919 revolution and people like Said Darwish, for instance, is a good example of the most famous star of the early 1920s who dies tragically young. Everyone wants to have their own Said Darwish story. And then the other kind of stories that we ought to be very careful are these sort of generic stories that could be about anyone. And I've quoted here Frédéric Lagrange, who's done a lot of really great work on music of this period, and whose work I recommend you look at. This is from a podcast he did with the Amar Foundation in Beirut, in which he says, so Naimael Masreya is linked in the imaginary of journalists and the Arab collective unconscious to an era during which people drank champagne in the shoes of Matriba, lit cigars with banknotes. These nonsensical cliches, probably born from the years between World War I and World War II in America and Europe, hide the scarcity of information about her. So there's a real sense that a lot of the stories are later kind of exaggerations. And if I can play a video, I'm hoping this works. A great example of this is the film about Shafiqa Leptia. So Shafiqa, who was a star of the 1890s cabaret, about whom we know a little bit, but not that much. Her life was turned into a film and also a play in the 1960s, which has done probably more than anything to cement the popular idea of what it was like in a nightclub back. This is supposed to be, I suppose, the 1890s, but it clearly isn't. And I think, as Frédéric Lagrange says, seems to be influenced by European film almost, even. So I'm going to try and play it a little. I'll stop it there, although I could play the whole thing. I mean, it's a great film. And not criticizing the film for being, playing around a little bit with aesthetics and history, because that's sort of the job of a film. But it's these kind of things that have built up an image in people's heads often, and then become what is the image. So Shafiqa here is dancing with a candlestick on her head, and she is always said to have been the woman who invented this dance with the candlestick, though there seems to be like pretty little evidence of that. And even, I mean, I think people may have danced with candlesticks on their head in the 1890s. They certainly, I've seen pictures of people dancing with shisha pipes on their head. So candlesticks seems to be not a big step, but that's the kind of thing that I would be wary about reading back too much on the period. Oh, so good. And then finally, there are women who fall between the cracks of these stories. So what we really have that survives are the stories of the stars, the people who made it. The Rosa Youssef, Badiya Masabni, Naimael Masreya, people who could go on to write memoirs or just be really extensively covered in the press. And so the unsuccessful, we don't really know what their stories are. I mean, there's one exceptional kind of instance of this woman, Imtisal Fauzi, who in the 1930s was kind of coming up as a star, managed to get her own cabaret with another woman called Mary Mansour, was threatened by the local kind of gang, extorted and murdered actually on stage. And then her case became this huge cause célèbre in Egypt. And she was kind of, there's a good article by Sean Lopez about how she then becomes this example as an innocent murdered woman, as opposed to other dancers who are sort of seen as maybe bringing these kind of things upon themselves, or that kind of thing. But we know about her story, but there are really many women who must have been low-level kind of dancers, singers, actresses, who we really don't know that much about. The people who weren't making much money, who maybe only performed for 5 or 10 years. People, yeah, as I say, who didn't write memoirs, and often people who sort of can't easily be categorized. And this is one thing that I've been wondering about, but I don't want to go too far with it. But so if a lot of these memoirs were written in the 50s and 60s, they also reflect this kind of more Arab nationalist outlook. And therefore, who gets to write memoirs are often people who can be easily categorized as Egyptian, or doing, moving on the national Egyptian culture. And so people who don't quite fit into that get left out. And I'll come to an end. So various Armenian performers, Ihsan Kamil, who was very famous, Nadira, the great singer, I don't think she wrote any memoirs, or really was covered that extensively. Her biography at least wasn't. And then there are people who don't appear in the press, and there's Naimael Masreya, who the photographer, or Heba Farid, who is based in Egypt, is her granddaughter, and she's been doing a lot of work trying to recover the story of her. Naimael Masreya, who was a reasonably popular singer at the time, but didn't appear a huge amount in the press. And Heba Farid speculates that she just didn't cultivate a good relationship with the press. I can't really comment on that, but there must have been lots of other women who just really fall between the cracks, whose stories I couldn't tell. Ifrans Hanem, another Armenian, in fact, or Turkish or Armenian, it's unclear, dancer who really made a big splash in Cairo, but doesn't sort of only makes it into a kind of few gossipy articles, no memoirs, all of this kind of stuff. And we have to ask what their stories would look like. We've seen what the standard memoir of a successful star looks like, overcoming adversity, usually by themselves, often against either conservatism or against, often men, in either the sexual advances of men, or, and various other things, and eventually succeeding. But what does the story of someone who doesn't succeed look like? And I know Diana Abani, who I think is in Beirut, has been looking at the stories of women in the magazine El Asifa, and sort of going through them. These are small page-long stories of some of the more minor women, and the way that she sees it, these are often much less positive about the nightclub scene, and often the women in it say they would really rather not be nightclub singers or actresses. They're only doing it for the money, and they can't wait until they don't have to do it anymore. So these kind of, that's, I'm going to end there, I think, although I could go on. I will just, by way of conclusion, say that, so there are gaps in the stories that we can tell. There are problems with the sources about the stories that we do tell, but I think that's true of any history of 100 years ago. But what the nightlife scene does offer us is a new way of looking at the interwar period in Egypt, and particularly a new way of looking at the lives of women in the interwar period of Europe. I put this cartoon in here because I love it, but also, the point being, we can sweep away those pictures that have nothing in but men and see, in, of course, qualified ways, but extremely interesting ones, what it would look like if we centered women in the story of 1920s and 30s Egypt. And one of the places that we can really, really do that, and one of the few places we can really do that, is on the nightclub stages and in the cabarets and in the theaters. And the story doesn't always look great, but no story really ever does. So I look forward, hopefully, to some questions.
Thank you, Raphael. Thanks for this fascinating lecture, and thank you for offering us a peek into your wonderful piece of research. Thank you. I also find it very interesting, to read this in parallel also with memoirs and autobiographies written by male intellectuals or writers of the time, right? And I see, that here you find a kind of similar pattern, right, with these successful life stories. At the same time, I'm actually surprised to see also how this outbreak of the private, in comparison, for example, with life stories of Kulthum, which I usually, know as a person who was very reserved about her life, right? Who was very keen on keeping the media outside of her life.
I can talk about that, but finish what you were going to say.
Yeah, no, and thanks also for offering us, this for highlighting the challenge of methodology, with how to approach this methodologically and so on. So my first question to you is basically one thing is, how emancipatory were these stories, these life stories? Were these, if we read, for example, in parallel with these successful autobiographies by male authors, right? Were these encouraging women at the time also to kind of come out on the public sphere, showing their life, talking about life details and so on? And at the same time, like, where is the limit? So what is that cannot be said about their life? What is private there? You showed, for example, weight details, or so that's one question that interests me. And then I would also love to hear, if you have time, about what it meant to be an actress or an artist at that time. What were the stories that were told, about being on the stage itself? Thank you. And I'm sure there are also questions from the audience. So please, for those who are listening, please raise your hand via the chat if you would like to add the question, or also use the chat itself to write your question. Thank you.
Okay, well, so I'll answer those questions first. And I'm going to answer, before I answer the questions, I'll sort of pick up on your point about Kulthum. And so there were a lot of different ways, of course, that different women engaged with these problems of private life and what to give and exactly what they wrote about in these memoirs. There are a lot of patterns, but of course, each case is slightly different. Kulthum's case is really is very different in that she, like you say, she put up this wall kind of to the press, and especially in the 1920s. People say because of her father that she really didn't talk to the press very much. She didn't tour abroad and kept her private life like intensely separate, which in itself is perhaps in some ways a strategy of, well, definitely is a strategy of dealing with the press, but also a strategy of getting up this picture of yourself. So in the 20s, people were endlessly speculating about her and writing articles about how enigmatic she was and all of this kind of stuff. So maybe the answer is she just couldn't win, really, or maybe it's part of just a building up of a different kind of public persona to say someone like Naimael Masreya, who was very flamboyant and lived in her houseboat and gave these great parties and everyone wanted to talk about her. So maybe these are two different ways of approaching it. So your first question was how emancipatory all of this was, basically. And it's a difficult question to answer. There are some ways in which the answers vary. So, for instance, when you have Rosa Youssef in the 1920s, who has been an actress for 10 years or so, a little bit more, and has, faced a lot of criticism in the press when she sets up her own magazine. She is very keen to write articles on the women's page in the editorials, encouraging, for example, other women to join the world of work. Explicitly saying, come on, follow your European and Turkish, she says, sisters and work. And she tries briefly to employ women to distribute the magazine, although that kind of doesn't work. But she's, actively trying to build a kind of feminist movement in some way. In other cases, the way in which this could be seen as emancipatory, and I think it is simply by living this kind of independent life and writing about, or it being written about in the press, giving interviews about it. People saying, like Badiya Masabni saying, you don't need to get married. In fact, it's better for artists if you don't get married. I think that's an emancipatory way of living. But you could come back at that and say, oh, but really they weren't. What were they actually doing for other women? Tangibly unclear. But I think for those reasons, I think you can say that it is an emancipatory time. And the second question was, what was life like? Stories. There's so many stories of the kind of life on stage. That's why this kind of whole, which I didn't say actually before. Another reason to read all of these entertainment magazines and memoirs is they're just really fun and full of these great stories of things that went on. The ones that I like best are the stories about what happened on tour, when there were, often people would go on these. So in the summertime, people would go on tours of Hashem or Iraq or North Africa mostly, and they would have all these wild stories about no one behaving themselves, people having, staying up all night and getting drunk and then missing the train, or all of this kind of thing. They're the most fun stories, but it's so full of them.
Thank you. I'm sure also your book has a lot of more details about these stories. So thank you, Raphael. I have already 4 hands raised with more questions, and let me see. I will follow the order on Zoom. So I think Albrecht was the first.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for a fascinating talk. My question is, have you, in the material you have studied, is there, or to what extent is opposition to this kind of lifestyle reflected in the memoirs? Whether that be, just conservative in general, or explicitly Islamically motivated. After all, the Muslim Brotherhood emerges in the 1920s, partly out of, social, economic, and cultural opposition to what is being perceived as westernized lifestyles. So I was wondering whether these memoirs at all reflect this opposition and how they deal with it, if they do so.
Yeah, well, my favorite story on that, and there are quite a few, is from Rosa Youssef's memoirs, and this also sums up how, what I more see is a kind of bourgeois secular national opposition to nightlife. As the 20s and 30s go on, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood become more powerful, and there's a more Islamic element to it. But so there's this story in Rosa Youssef from the late 1910s, in which she is in a theater troupe which is funded by Talat Harb, the nationalist banker. And she is in the troupe. The troupe's gone on tour to Alexandria, and they're all on a break down at the beach, and she's wearing a swimming suit, some kind of pajama. And Talat Harb is there and sees her and thinks that this is not the kind of image that he wants, a woman in a swimming suit in his theater troupe. This is not the kind of image for a sort of new Egypt that he is trying to build, that he wants to see portrayed. So he tries to force the theater troupe to sack her. Then her friends sort of try and smooth it all over, try and make her apologize, but she refuses to apologize. And then she is kicked out of the troupe, but she stays around for sort of a few days with them, sitting in her swimming costume just to annoy Talat Harb, basically. I mean, that's one example of many in which they really see themselves pushing back against this kind of conservative establishment. And I kind of see this period as a kind of the theater as a counterculture in a way, pushing back against the conservative establishment in some way. But broadly, it seems to me, although of course religiously motivated in a lot of cases, that the kind of idea of a respectable new nation is the thing that's most sort of pushing back against, that these women are pushing back against in some ways, and which is pushing back against them. And then it's not probably till the 40s and 50s that it becomes more, that the Muslim Brotherhood becomes more prominent and all this. That's my interpretation of the events.
Thank you, Raphael. So Amal Matar is next on my list. Please, Amal, welcome to ask your question.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting talk. I was just curious how the politics during that time affected the lives of these women, in terms of, like, we see very clearly during Nasser time and now how the actors and actresses should portray a certain look for, what should I say, like acceptable political view. And was that the case during this time, or was it different?
I mean, that politics is definitely sort of involved in all of this. I mean, the politics of the 1920s in Egypt is obviously is very different to how it is now, and there's all these competing kind of parliamentary wise, whether you support the Weft or whether you support the liberal constitutionalists or something, was an issue. I mean, broadly speaking, so someone like Rosa Youssef was very pro-Weft, but Munir al-Mahdeya would sort of have politicians from all stripes kind of over at her house. But the one thing which was pretty consistent throughout all of them is another kind, is a nationalist feeling in a certain way. So in the 1920s, you have, although Egypt is independent in 1922, the British are there, and there's a sense that really there's not full independence in Egypt, and that Egypt is not sort of yet standing up as a sort of fully sovereign nation. And you see that debate really being played out on the stages a lot. Most prominently, probably in the material that people choose. And so there's a big emphasis on performing, for instance, Egyptian plays. Exactly what it means to perform an Egyptian play is, of course, up for debate. Whether that could mean just a one that's written by an Egyptian, or one that features pressing current Egyptian issues. But that in that way, women are really are kind of leading a political movement. Whether or not they're pressured to do it, I would say no, probably. I don't see much evidence for that. There are other ways in which they're pressured to do a lot of things. Pressured to be respectable. To pick up on Albrecht's point from before, say in the 1910s, for instance, it was if you were an actress, you had to sign in your contract that you would not sit around in a cafe after the performance and sort of be visible, because that was seen as disrespectful. So there's a lot of not disrespectful, but not muhtaram or something. So there's a lot of that's the kind of pressure that's really being exerted on women at the time.
Amal, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, yes. I have a question regarding your book. Do you have an ebook version?
There is an ebook version, and so I mean, I don't know where you're.
I'm in Stockholm. How can I get access to that?
I mean, it's published in the UK and the US, and it's a Kindle. I don't know what I mean. If you send me an email afterwards, I'll give you some. I'll type my email in here if anyone else wants it. I'll see if I can help you find it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Amal. Pell is next on my list, and then Jonathan.
Hello, hi Rap, it's good to see you. Thanks to the organizers and thanks to you for your wonderful talk and your superlative book. So, as you know, I'm working on similar themes and topics in Iraq during the same period. And I wanted to ask you, so in my work, it's been sort of possible to reconstruct the lives of the sort of famous divas, Afifa Iskandar, Salima Murad, etc. But one of my main struggles is to sort of write the history of the many, many, many women who, as you say, were unsuccessful or did not become famous, right? And there are many reasons for this, and I really think that a lot of your conjectures are correct, but I wanted to ask you a little more, not as a criticism, but sort of as a, how do we write this history? And I think, in the case of Iraq, most nightclubs had sort of one or two very famous singers. The rest, which was often many women, were just simply not famous, right? Some worked in sort of the gray zone between sex work and entertainment. Some were more mobile, actually, and circulated between different clubs in, Baghdad and other urban centers. Some sort of married and stopped performing. Some, have simply completely fallen between the archival cracks. But yeah, I just simply wanted to ask you, because I'm guessing that it must have been similar in Egypt, where the vast majority of performers were actually never became famous, right? And so how can we sort of write the history of their labor, back into the story? So I guess I just wanted to ask you about, a little bit of brainstorming. And then I think I'll just very quickly add that, in Iraq too, sort of the opposition to this lifestyle and performance totally also came from sort of more secular nationalist elites. The anxiety that these new spaces of entertainment and leisure created can be read through short stories, newspaper articles, and sort of writings of Iraqi intellectuals who were not necessarily Muslim, but also Christian and Jewish or completely secular. But thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question that I think about all the time, and I try to answer a little bit. There's a few approaches. One is the you get lucky approach, and just and you go through all of the magazines and pick out little bits of story. And I think there's definitely something that can be said for doing that. You never get a really very full story. I mean, so Diana Bernie's stuff, going through these little stories in Al-Sifa is good, and then you pick a kernel and then you attach lots of things to it. You can kind of get stuff. It's never full. Family archives like Heba Farid's, if you can find them, great. As I sort of hinted at, a lot of times when you really find out about the people who are very low down, and particularly the people who are, as you say, somewhere between sex work and performance, a lot of times it's in police reports and things, or when they get picked up by the police doing a crime, or in the case of Imtithal Al-Fawzi, when someone is murdered, then you have a lot of information about them. Again, these are kind of tiny partial bits of the story. And I think I don't know if you've read the book by Saidiya Hartman, a recent one, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. I think it's called that. In which she comes up with this image of the chorus line, in which all you can really do is as the like the chorus line, which is there as this collective, in which all the individuals are the individual is not important, it's the collective. All you can kind of do is tell this, bring little bits of the stories of some people and bring them together into broader story which then tells something else. I mean, it's of course like a little bit yeah, it's not that pleasing because you do actually just want to know a lot of details about life stories. But yeah, I mean, I come across exactly the same problems and I'm trying to find answers.
Okay, now next one is Jonathan. Please, Jonathan, ask your question.
Yes, hello, and thank you, Raphael, for the wonderful talk. One thing you mentioned that made me curious, you were talking about women expressing themselves as a public performance in the press, and how there are several meta-narratives in how you are expected to present the life story of a nightclub star, and how certain ludicrous images come in from Anglo-American culture, like drinking champagne out of schools and smoking dollar bills or whatever. And following up on what Pelles was asking, I was curious if you notice any interesting differences and similarities in how these narratives are constructed in other theater areas, whether it's in Beirut or Baghdad, or whether it's Weimar, Berlin, or the West End. Do you think there is a specific Egyptian component to how these narratives are constructed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I sort of lean towards the answer that there, I mean, obviously there are specific Egyptian parts, but as in general, this was a kind of global phenomenon of the 1920s. You know, these nightclub scenes were springing up all over the world, like you say, you know, in Weimar, Berlin, or in Paris, or America, and a lot of the same people are traveling between them. And you know, acts come from Paris and spend the winter in Cairo, and acts go to Cairo and spend come from Cairo, spend the summer in Beirut, and you know, sometimes go to Paris. So for me, I mean, when you read Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, for instance, the similarities are kind of so striking of, you know, the wealthier man who takes a shine to a nightclub dancer and then, you know, starts a relationship with her, tries to quote unquote educate her, and you know, all of this kind of stuff seems to be so common. And you'll find in Egypt in the 1920s short stories basically talking about that exact same thing. These relationships between men and women, which are so common in novels and things of the 1920s, in, you know, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and there's the Berlin equivalent of that, which name I now forget, like Artificial Silk Girl, I think it's called. What is striking is how similar all the stories are. Now, whether or not that's partly me reading that into it, and also partly people in Egypt in the 1920s reading those stories into their own nightlife, I can't say. But I lean towards more similarities really than differences in all of these nightclub scenes, even though obviously every area has its own specifics. The base, sort of what's going on underneath all of it, seems to be very similar.
Very interesting, Raphael, and this also links, I think, with the question of cosmopolitanism, that I think is also a side aspect of this story, right? Of how Cairo was actually Dunya, because it was also a space where really different nationalities and cultures were encountering, and also this was reflected in the entertainment scene. Yeah, I have a last question for you. If no one else also wants to ask, but I was thinking also, you were saying in the beginning that not all these stories were successful as they were depicted, right, in these memoirs and so on. So I was wondering if you want to share with us also how some of these life stories unfolded after, you know, after the 60s or 70s, when these celebrities actually started to get old, and many of these life stories took took maybe different, right, a different turn. I'm thinking, for example, of Tahia Carioca, who in late life was almost often depicted with the abaya and the veil and so on.
Yeah, and in the same way that there's this sort of very striking pattern in the early lives of so many women, you know, having their fathers die, poverty, then going onto the stage quite young, making it, etc. There's also this pattern in their later lives, which almost all of them sort of as Carl said, the meta narrative is very similar for all of them, which is in the case of Naimael Masreya, in the case of Fatima Rushdie, in the case of Fatima Rushdie, they have this peak, then get forgotten, and tend to die alone, as it were, or at least, if not necessarily alone, kind of die unfulfilled. So the meta narrative goes, and this is specific to Egypt. I think, or at least a lot of times then the story also says they become religious, like Tahir Carioca and Naimael Masreya. It's often said about her that what she did when she retired was go on Hajj 7 times or 8 or however many people want to say. The numbers are different. And yeah, that I wanted to also try and avoid. I think there's something like troubling about that meta narrative, although, and except for the religious part, also it's very similar to a lot of the stories of women of the 1920s and 30s in general around the world. I mean, one who I know as British, the British example is Nina Hamnet, who maybe people don't know outside of the UK, but lived this sort of amazing life and then died in alcoholism, and she committed suicide. I mean, of course, suicide is also another big meta narrative, Marilyn Monroe, what have you. And yeah, I think there's a lot of problems with that. And like, as Emil just said in the chat, there's a kind of implicit moral that people want you to read in it, is that, oh, if you're not muhtarama, you know, you can be successful when you're at your peak, but you will have to have a sad ending.
Exactly.
And I don't know how to sort of somehow write around that story, how to avoid that story in a lot of ways, because I mean, partly unless you want to switch around chronology, everyone's life ends with their death. You can't, and no one's death is great. It's like it's never a triumphant moment, really, unless you're Kulthum and 1 million people come out for your funeral. But so in a way, you can't. It's hard to avoid, but you also need to try and avoid that moralizing message somehow. And also, the one part of these women's lives that they can never tell themselves is their death. I mean, someone always is going to tell that for them. So it's a part of their story over which they have no control.
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree. Yes, but this also opens, actually. I mean, I think your book in general and your research opens for so many, actually, similar projects and different ways of approaching archives and non-state archives. So, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts and these findings with us today.
Right.
Thank you very much also to everyone who joined us on this event. And I think we can stop here now. It's 1:30. And thank you, Raphael, for accepting our invitation.